Good evening. Since we're just starting the video, let me say welcome to those that are joining us on Facebook and YouTube as well. We're looking at Matthew chapter 24 tonight. This is a second lesson entitled False Teachings About Christ's Second Coming. Last week, as we began looking at these false teachings, we first of all did a chart, and since the PowerPoint's not working tonight, it wanted to upgrade the PowerPoint. There's no Wi-Fi back here, so it couldn't. So anyway, there was a chart I gave you last week, and many of you brought one. Hopefully you have yours with you. The left-hand side of that chart kind of starts from the left and gives the flow of the premillennial theory of the end of time. Christ comes to earth is the first thing, and they're talking about his first coming. And that was when he came with two objectives in mind. One, to die for the sins of mankind, and two, to set up a physical kingdom here upon the earth. Those that hold to this theory say he did accomplish number one, so they're right in that. He died for the sins of mankind. But number two, he failed, according to them, to set up an earthly kingdom, which that's true. He did not set up one. Now, I wouldn't say he failed because that wasn't his objective. But they say because he was rejected by the Jews, he failed in that attempt. And so when he comes back a second time, he's going to set up an earthly kingdom. In the meantime, the church is an afterthought, according to their theory. So we talked about that last week, saw from Scripture how that wasn't right, and saw what Scripture actually taught about the kingdom that Christ came and set up. Tonight, we're going to talk about the signs in Matthew chapter 24. Premillennial, those that hold to the premillennial theory, say that these signs that Jesus talks about there in Matthew 24 are still to be fulfilled. And when they are fulfilled, that's when we'll know that he's about to come, because these signs will all be fulfilled. So that's the second element of the premillennial theory. Now, the primary source is Matthew 24 for this thinking of this passage or this idea. And that's where we're going to be for the most part tonight. So if you want to go ahead and open your Bibles there. That passage has long been a favorite of those who make predictions about when the end of time is going to take place. Not just premillennialists, but anybody that's gone about trying to predict the end of time. For example, in 1920, Judge Rutherford, who was one of the early leaders of the Jehovah's Witnesses, he wrote that Jesus' prophecy in Matthew 24, verse 7, that nation shall rise up against nation and kingdom against kingdom, he says that was fulfilled 6 years earlier in 1914 with the beginning of World War I. So that, he said, Jesus was predicting World War I back when he talked in Matthew 24. Incidentally, that's in Judge Rutherford's book entitled Millions Now Living Will Never Die, which is a very basic, fundamental book for the Jehovah's Witnesses. He also went ahead to state, and remember he's writing in 1920, he also went ahead to state that the pestilence that was going on with the great wave of flu, remember we've been hearing the last couple of years about the 1918 flu epidemic, he said that's the pestilence that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24, and it was sweeping over the world at that time. He also said that the earthquakes that Jesus talked about in Matthew 24 were the revolutions that took place at that time in Russia, in Germany, and Austria, and Hungary. All of these were predicted by Jesus according to Judge Rutherford. And thus he said it's about time. We're looking at the end times, and I don't remember if he said a specific date, but he was writing in 1920. 60 years later, a man by the name of Hal Lindsey, and you may remember that name, he wrote a book entitled The 1980s Countdown to Armageddon. In his book, on page 181, he said, quote, "We are the generation which will see the end of the present world and the return of Jesus Christ," end quote. Lindsay believes that Matthew 24 provides the basis for predicting that the end of the world will come soon. He finds today's earthquakes and wars and famines and similar events all to be signs that indicate that the end of the world is going to come in our lifetime. So that kind of gives you an idea where a lot of the world is. A lot of Western society anyway, where they're coming from. So the point of saying all of that is that virtually all of those who make predictions about when the end of the world is going to come lean heavily on Matthew 24. And so it's imperative, I think, that we spend a little time tonight talking about what is Jesus actually talking about in Matthew 24. What's he pointing to? What about these so-called signs of the end, end quote? So this evening we're going to look at Matthew 24 for ourselves and see just what Jesus' intent was. To start out with, let's look back into the latter part of chapter 23. In fact, I want to go all the way back to verse 29. In chapter 23, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, and the disciples are listening, but these are where he exposed the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and all of their false teachings. He lists in verses 13 and following, 8 times he says, "Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites," and so on. So you come to verse 29, and we begin reading there. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if we had been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how will you escape the sentence of hell? Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall," and notice that in verse 35, "upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So those verses that we just read are the tail end of what Jesus is saying to the Pharisees. So that's, okay, number one on the handout. In this passage, Jesus accuses the Jewish leaders of decorating the graves of the prophets who were killed in the past, while they actually are going to become the murderer no, not murderer. They're going to become the chief prophet killers. So that fills in that first. And I'm going to try to remember to give you the blanks, fill in the blanks, since it's not going to be on the screen like I wanted it to be. So they were going to become the chief prophet killers. As a result of this, in number 2, he says that their house is going to be left, what did he say? Desolate. That's a strong word, desolate. Their house, what does he mean by that?
Their culture.
Their culture, their city, their temple, their places where they actually live, their literal houses are all going to be destroyed. And who does he say that this is going to happen to? As he sets a timetable. It's going to happen to you, to this generation, those of this generation. So he gets pretty specific as he addresses them there. You, this generation. Now, if he just said you, it might be, a little vague, because he can talk about you, and it's just a pronoun that can be applied to any group, any time. But when he specifically says this generation, that narrows it down quite a bit, doesn't it? Obviously then, Jesus is saying that the destruction is going to come on the people to whom he is speaking, the ones that he says, this generation. All right, so that everything that's said in chapter 23, including what we just read at the end of the chapter, it takes place in the temple courtyard. Jesus is talking to them there, and so they're seeing the temple. And remember, this is Herod's temple that Herod had built fairly recently. It doesn't have the beauty and the grandeur of Solomon's temple, which was destroyed by the Babylonians. But Herod had built this temple. And so as they are walking away, the disciples call his attention. As we look at verse 1, of chapter 24, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to Jesus. So they point out all these buildings, how beautiful they were, and they were magnificent. Much use of marble, gold. Despite not being as grand as Solomon's temple, it was still a grand temple. Herod built in the temple there at Jerusalem one of the most beautiful buildings of the ancient world. And it seems, as they point out all of this to Jesus, they've heard what he's just said to the Pharisees, and it seems like they're saying, at least perhaps saying, do you really mean all of this is going to be destroyed? And they're looking around at the beauty of the temple. And so, lest there be any doubt, look at what Jesus says in verse 2. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down. Now, if you stop right there at the end of verse 2, what's Jesus talking about? Destruction of the temple. All of that's going to be destroyed, to the point that not even one stone is going to be left standing on top of the other. That's the extent of it. That's number 4. That not one stone shall be left on another. Did we get number 3?
Yeah.
Did you get that filled in? Okay. All right. This was fulfilled in AD 70, about 40 years after Jesus is speaking. In AD 70, the Roman general Titus brought the Roman army and laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. Now, again, I wish I had a PowerPoint, because I've got 7 pictures I want to show you at this point. Linda, if you look on the Sermons and Devos page, sometime after we get home here in a little bit, Linda will post the transcript of what I'm looking at. It may not be exactly what I say, but what I'm looking at here, and she's got those 7 pictures, and so they will be posted. There is evidence of all of this. Titus, as the Romans were prone to do, when he got back to Rome, they built what's called the Arch of Titus that still stands in Rome today, and it depicts the destruction of the temple. And you can see some of it is pretty worn, not real clear cut as it's etched into the stone, but these 7 pictures that I was going to use, one is just of the arch itself, and then the other one is a picture right inside the arch of them carrying away the furniture of the temple, the candlestick and the different parts of the temple, and just some close-up pictures then of that part of the arch. So Titus left a record of what he did to Jerusalem. Roman soldiers in this in the relief on the arch are seen carrying off the golden candlesticks, carrying off the table of showbread, other objects from the temple. An article that appeared in the June 2001 issue of Biblical Archaeological Review made a strong case for the spoils of the temple, providing the money for building much of the Roman Colosseum. The selling off of all of that stuff from the temple. So here Jesus tells the Jewish leaders and and his disciples that because of their killing of the prophets that the Jews had done and what they are about to do, that is Jesus and all of his, not all, but many of his followers, the temple, their city is all going to be destroyed. And it's going to happen when? To that generation. About 40 years down the road from when Jesus is talking here. So, between verse 2 and verse 3, Jesus and his disciples go ahead and leave the temple area and go out across the Kidron Valley and go up on the Mount of Olives. And from there, they can look down into the city and see the temple courtyard. And the disciples are still questioning about what's going on. When is this going to take place? What's happening? So in verse 3, they say, "Tell us when these things will happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age." Tell us when, they want to know, and what are the signs. Now, there are a couple of parallel passages that give us a little more understanding as to their question. In Mark chapter 13 and verse 4, and Luke chapter 21 verse 7. Those two parallel passages contain the question of the disciples that's here in verse 3 of Matthew 24. Really, there are two questions they ask. Number one, when's this going to happen? Number two, what are going to be the signs so we can know when this is going to happen? So they want to know their use of the term end of the age does not necessarily mean end of the world, end of the age of Judaism, as far as the first century is concerned. So Jesus then begins in verse 4 to answer their questions, those two questions that they've asked. And he goes to answer them. He's already said, and we've already seen, that all of this is going to take place within the lifetime of those now living. The ones who are going to kill him, the ones that are going to persecute the church and killing early Christians. And just to make sure that we understand that, jump down in Matthew 24 here to verse 34. Matthew 24, verse 34. Jesus says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." He's already said it once, but he said it again here. So between the two times that he says that, everything that he talks about between those two times of chapter 23, verse 36, chapter 24, verse 34, all of that's going to happen to that generation that Jesus is speaking to there. Let's see. Number 7 there, Jesus has already said these things would happen to those to whom he was speaking because they would be the ones to kill him. But to emphasize the point in verse 34, he adds that all these things that are predicted prior to that will happen to this generation. All right? So the answer to the when question is during the lifetime of those who were listening to Jesus on that occasion, that generation. Okay? Everybody's with me so far? All right, let's go back to verse 4 of chapter 24. Jesus begins here to answer the second question of the disciples, and that is, when will be the sign of these things about to take place? And he begins in verse 4 with a warning. He says, "See to it that no one misleads you." Warning them, be careful who you listen to. He's just predicted the temple's going to be destroyed in their lifetime. He's afraid that they're going to live in constant fear because there will always be some kind of trouble going on. So to relieve some of the anxiety on the part of the disciples, he tells them, don't be fooled by the troubles that will be going on. So let's read a few verses here, beginning in verse 5. "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars, rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened, for those things must take place, but that is not the end yet. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And in various places there will be famines and earthquakes, but all these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come." So verses 4 to 14 are there to help early Christians to not be afraid, to not live in fear all of their lives. These events are going to happen. Those wars, rumors of wars, false Christ, famines, earthquakes, even persecutions against Christians in the church. Those are all going to happen, but those are not events from which anyone can draw any conclusion about when Jerusalem will fall. are all going to be taking place. Verse 15, Jesus does here give a real sign by which they can take some action. Verse 15, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So, what does he say is the real sign?
When the army comes in,
He calls it the abomination of desolation from Daniel, but it's a Roman army. When they see the Roman army starting to come and start gathering around and lay siege to the city of Jerusalem, what does he tell them to do?
leave.
Get out of Dodge. Flee to the mountains. Flee to the mountains. This is number 10, by the way. Flee as quickly as possible. Because he's going to go ahead in the next verse or two there, and he says, verse 17, whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get things out of his house. Whoever's in the field must not turn back and get his clothes. In other words, when you see this happening, drop everything and run. Don't get caught inside the city in siege, because it's going to be horrible, and it was horrible. So that's the real sign. And when they see that taking place, when this army comes, the Roman army comes, as a fulfillment, and by the way, that prophecy of Daniel is in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. That's the sign when all of this destruction that he's talking about of the city and of the temple is going to take place. You might hear about earthquakes. You might hear about wars, rumors of wars. You might hear about and even experience persecution. But those are not the events that will indicate to them that the end of the Jewish age has arrived with the destruction of the temple that was coming. When you see the army of Rome surrounding the city of Jerusalem. So they were then, he said in verse 16, quickly, flee to the mountains. And the idea, the word flee has the idea of quickness and is a part of it. Let me ask a question. Is that good advice for the end of the world?
Not really.
No.
It's not gonna matter where you're
No,
at.
it's not going to matter where you're at. You're not going to be able to flee anywhere, either to the mountains or anywhere to get away. Is it good advice if the city of Jerusalem is surrounded by the Roman army?
Yeah.
Is it good advice? Yeah.
It might be a little late.
Maybe. Depends on, if they see it, as soon as they see it, if they start getting, and do what he says, don't go back and get anything, you just go. So, go very fast, he says. Now, he talks about starting in 19, about some conditions that's going to make a quick departure a little more difficult. He says, not in verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Why? Harder to flee. Can't flee as fast. You can't, you got to gather up some things to take with a baby. They didn't have to worry about formula or anything like that, but it's still more difficult to flee with a baby or even young children. Verse 20, but pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. Why?
Couldn't travel far enough.
Couldn't go very far on the Sabbath, and it's harder to travel in the wintertime. They didn't have cars they could go jump in and drive out to the hills outside of Jerusalem and get away. Verse 21, for there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. So Jesus is telling them it's going to be bad. Now, how useful is this advice for the end of the world? Not at all. Not going to help anything at all. Do we need to flee to the hills then? Well, I don't know what city we'd look for an army to gather around, unless they're talking about the so-called Battle of Armageddon we'll talk about in a few more weeks. Which never, by the way, if you look at that carefully in Revelation, it never takes place. They start gathering soldiers, but it never takes